Hello, everyone. It's Jeff Rich from the Burning Archive, and welcome to my live stream, my video, if you're watching on a replay, of how the Ukraine war is ending. It really does seem over the last few weeks that we are approaching the phase where the Ukraine war is ending. But how will it end? Will it end with a bang? One hopes not, or a whimper. It was T.S. Eliot, of course, who said, this is how the world ends, this is how the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Are we seeing something similar in Ukraine? A bang would be, who knows, like a big, Nobel Prize for Donald Trump, maybe, or, of course, a more dramatic and disastrous, tragic escalation of the conflict. The entry, perhaps, of European peacekeeping forces into Ukraine. A whimper. Some might see that as appeasement. Some might see it as just people talking softly and starting to find their way to peace. And perhaps that is what we are seeing. So I hope everyone can see me okay. I'm just having a little bit of an issue with the chat, but I'm just going to soldier on, assuming everything is okay. I'm certainly being led to believe that the stream is doing okay. Or I guess another way the Ukraine war could end would be like a barroom fight between J.D. Vance and various EU leaders. That seemed to be the way things were going a few days ago after J.D. Vance's appearance, not only at the Munich security dialogue, where he kind of delivered what I call a hillbilly harangue, but also, importantly, a few days earlier at a global meeting or conference on regulating AI, where the United States of America yet again exempted itself from the rules of the world and said that they will do AI their way. So, and no doubt we all know who J.D. Vance's the interest that J.D. Vance was representing there. Or will it be none of those? Will it just be a long, difficult road towards peace negotiations? I think it was Thomas Mann who once said that war is easy, the work of peace is difficult. But today, literally this morning, Australian time, we seem to have received the news of the Sergei Lavrov and Marco Rubio meeting in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, where it was Marco Rubio who himself said this is a first step on a long walk towards peace. And he seems to have at least some level of serious intent towards that. And I'm going to talk about the agreements and outcomes of that meeting shortly on the show. So absolutely welcome everyone to the live stream. I'm just having a little bit of trouble seeing my comments at the moment. I'm sorry about that. But what I can also tell you is if you just leave comments or questions in the chat, I will come back to them a bit later. Hopefully the stream issue will be resolved. Okay, so and I could go and check my broadcast, but I might, I guess, just soldier on at this point. Okay, so there are a lot of quick takes obviously going on at the moment about what's going on with the war, what the outcome of it all is, that sort of thing. And and especially with the fireworks and the theatrics and the tears and the temper tantrums, or so-called temper tantrums, that were going on last week after the Munich security dialogue, and also after Pete Hegseth's appearance with the defence ministers, Defence Contact Group, I think it's called, where he basically said, pay up, you pay for the war, Europe, because we want to go and fight another war over against China, for God's sake. There's been a lot of theatrics and a lot of hopes, fears, resentments, sense of shame and humiliation. An awful lot of emotions have been coursing around. And while there's been a big focus on the Munich security dialogue, it seems that maybe those talk there, the appearances there, was certainly one track of US foreign policy, one track of the resolution of the US-Ukraine war, but it perhaps is not the main track, and perhaps we've seen who the main protagonist and the main track of the resolution of this conflict are today at the Riyadh meeting. But it's absolutely clear that we are now shifting into a war termination phase, and people are struggling to deal with that, even as the reality of the actual outcome of the meeting between Lavrov and Rubio is starting to sink in. People are, some people are getting this right. I mean, the term that we are in a war termination phase is coming from videos I've just watched over the last, few hours, featuring Chaz Freeman, the former ambassador from the United States, and Lawrence Wilkerson, Colin Powell's former, staffer, who, is a vocal critic of current US foreign policy. Emmanuel Todd has similarly said, we are in the phase of American defeat. The challenge for not for Emmanuel Todd, the challenge for Donald Trump will be how he manages this defeat. And I guess it's all sorts of erratic signs are going on about that. Some people are still in denial. Keir Starmer from Britain has announced not only, a 100-year agreement between Ukraine and Britain, but he's also said that Britain stands at the ready to send its military forces, such as they are, yet again to Ukraine. Another Crimean War, another war of intervention like the Russian Civil War, more threats to Russia from Britain. It's like another charge at the Light Brigade from Keir Starmer. And many others are consoling themselves with various myths. I think a lot of the exuberance about J.D. Vance's hillbilly harangue, his speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he gave it to the Europeans, he, showed them who's boss and all that kind of thing, shame the Europeans to their faces, claim that, their democracy was failing when the whole world's been wondering about democracy in the United States for really quite some time. Then there's a lot of myths people are consoling themselves with there about, the decadent old world, eternally divided, and ever renewing America will renew itself again under Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. But I think and, I've done a video during the week on how I feel the Duran has perhaps been drawn into that American myth. I see overnight that they've done a long live with Robert Barnes, who I expressed some skepticism about in my recent video. And it's been really interesting reading everyone's comments on that video, but I guess I might check in on that video later. But we won't talk about that too much. But I think a lot of the one of the things people are missing in the sort of response of the Americans to this sort of, I know we started this war and we've wrecked Ukraine, but we're out, it's your problem now, Europe. I think a lot of what they're missing is the serious division in the United States. And in a way, the externalization of that division when Vance was addressing the enemy within, he was perhaps not only thinking about sort of Europeans, but he was also thinking of all those Americans who have fled to the shelter of NATO and the more aggressive anti-Russian countries in the hope that they can outlast, outwit and out-survive Donald Trump and his sort of new foreign policy directions, such as they are. I've noticed just yesterday that Anne Applebaum did a interview with some people at the Munich Security Dialogue Conference, and that Anne Applebaum is now describing herself as a Polish American. She's taken out Polish citizenship. I don't know if she has a Polish heritage in her family background, but she's certainly married to the Polish Foreign Minister, Sikorski, who is, one of the more aggressive Atlanticists. And there've been quite a few people, like the guy who does G0, I've just momentarily forgotten his name, who comment, one of those geopolitics type consultants, Ian Bremner, I think his name is. He has openly talked about the way in which the sort of pro-Atlanticist faction, let's say, within the American state can sort of, find temporary exile and refuge in European states. So I wonder if there's some of that going on in some of J.D. Vance's rhetoric as well. But I also think beyond the actual division of the EU, and a lot of the American commentators are a little bit patronising towards the EU, to be honest, openly contemptuous and channeling the same sort of old, cultural and historical memes that J.D. Vance channeled in his speech of the decadent old world consumed by its petty squabbles and ancient hatreds, versus, America, home of the brave and land of the free, or however it goes. The plucky true nation that has saved Europe from itself multiple times and all that kind of thing. So I think beyond that, I think there are actually two big things people are missing, I think, in their analysis of what's really going on. And there's been, I think, especially a tendency to analyse the EU response to these sort of statements from Americans in psychologizing, infantilizing sort of ways. They're having temper tantrums, and they're always hopeless, and they're globalists or whatever, things like this, which are not really major explanations. I think there is, in fact, a serious issue in dispute around the way this war termination is, not just between the United States and Russia, but between the European Union and the United States. We've seen with J.D. Vance's comments that, a lot of his rhetoric about freedom and freedom of speech and all that sort of stuff is a bit of a smoke screen for the American defiance of, trade rules, fair dealings, international regulation of AI. It's constant insistence that it can be an exception to any other kind of rule. And but I think there is a really critical issue in this war termination. Now, we know from history that one of the crucial issues about what happens at the end of a war is, what do you do with the debts incurred by the war? Wars are famously expensive. Wars contributed to the French Revolution. Wars contributed to the financial problems of many states over histories. And the dispute over war reparations was, tragically mishandled by America as much as anyone, who was the beneficiary of the European war debt, so to speak, during the Peace of Versailles in 1919. Leading into World War II. The debts of Britain, its financial losses during World War II, destroyed its empire and enabled America to basically cut out the British Empire as a superpower, as the British Empire wanted to be in the post-1945 world. So one of the main issues in war termination is who pays. Often it just becomes, it's not the headline issue, but it's often a very fundamental issue. Who pays and who gets the loot? And we've seen this issue in play, I guess, with Donald Trump's comments about, we want our money back. If you can't pay us, we'll then give us the rights to exploit your mineral resources. We won't mention all the people who, have died on behalf of our war aims, to weaken Russia and all that sort of thing. But, we want our money back. We don't want to leave this war with a debt. And that is one of the key issues facing the European Union. The European Union has actually incurred major debts. I don't have the figures in front of me, but they have a major financial exposure to the war. And what's also revealed in there is they had economic aims in this war as well. One of the key parts of Emmanuel Todd's diagnosis of the lead up to the Ukraine war was the EU's ambition to establish a stronger, dominant economic zone, a sort of almost neo-colonial, if you like, economic zone. Neo-colonial might be going too far, but to extend the significant German industrial zone that extends into Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Poland, etc., into Ukraine. And Ukraine, after all, is the largest country in Europe outside of Russia. So it is a major piece of real estate, a major set of economic resources, a major source of cheap labour. But it seems that the EU is not going to come out as it hoped in 2014. Victoria Newland's famous comment about that. The economic agreement between the EU and the Ukraine, which was one of the precipitating causes of this conflict, it is not going to come out with that. And what's more, as the war goes into this termination phase, it looks increasingly like, the Ukraine state may not be in the position, either financially or even legally, to pay back the EU anything ever. It may, totally disintegrate as a state. Its legitimacy has been questioned. The any agreements between the EU or the United States and Ukraine are now under question. So the United States sweeping in, demanding, as it actually has demanded, under duress, so to speak, that Zelensky hand over all the rare earths and whatnot, which he has refused to do so far, interestingly, then that is also the resource, I guess, that the EU wanted, perhaps one way or the other, to to sort of make up for the bad loans that it's made to the EU. And this conflict, this debate over how to handle the debt and the loot has been going on for some time. Not widely covered in the press, but I think it's one of the key issues that at the subterranean level is also driving a lot of the reaction of the EU leaders. They have a perhaps not unreasonable complaint that not only is as J.D. Vance and Donald Trump sort of, all these people have died, but we're out kind of thing, morally bankrupt. But they are also basically acting like, like compradors or like a aggressive merger and acquisition manager, which I guess maybe J.D. Vance at some point was, and certainly Donald Trump, as a business is going under. So there's that big issue that I think is especially important, especially as the constitutionality of the Ukraine state seems to be about to disintegrate. And then the other big thing about this that people are perhaps missing about this termination phase of the Ukraine war is that let me just have one. I just quickly lost my train of thought there. The other big thing is that it's not just about ending a conflict in Ukraine. There are other conflict. This is a war termination phase of broader significance, of more wars than just the one in Ukraine, or at least those other war termination phases or peace development phases are sort of being stacked on top of this conflict. There's, and I'll say more about that later. I mean, clearly there's been a long conflict between Russia and the NATO countries, principally the United States. That is what the whole, NATO eastward expansion is about. It's been going on for at least 30 years. Arguably, it's been going on since 1945 or even 1917. So there is that issue as well. And then there's also the whole issue of the conflicts all around the world about American primacy, the struggles around the world for a new world order, for a post-1945 world. And that is to some degree where this key issue of a collective security agreement in Europe, but not only in Europe, really comes into the fore. Is the United States prepared to start to move into a different mode in terms of its international relations? In a way, the way in which the United States concludes this or acts during this war termination phase of the Ukraine conflict is a kind of a confidence building measure about how it might act to deal with all the other conflicts the United States is involved in as the liberal rules-based order collapses, as American primacy goes through the floor, as the post-1945 world order disintegrates and a new way of doing international relations emerges. How will the United States act? So that compounding, I think, makes things more complex, it makes the negotiations more complex, and it makes the resolutions more complex as well. So I think they're some of the key things that people are missing. Because it is so overloaded and so complicated and so consequential as well. I mean, there is a sense of shock people have about this, this fundamental change or a rupture in the, transatlantic alliance, a need to actually adapt to a different world, a different set of processes for international relations. Then I think people are shocked. They are really struggling to come to terms with it emotionally, conceptually, and practically as well, because, world orders emerge out of a lot of chaotic processes, events, and conflicting interests and things. There is, in a way, no such thing as a world order. It's a mental construct that people draw out of a pattern of very complicated interaction between people. But people like Marco Rubio, people like Donald Trump actually have to kind of convert all that chaos into actionable steps and meaningful dialogue, like what appears to have happened in Riyadh, although one needs to be quite cautious, I guess, in assessing things. And that's what I'm going to come to in a moment. But I think I might just quickly pause there, if that's okay with everyone, and I'm just going to see if I can bring up my chat somehow, because it's a little bit annoying. I've been going for nearly half an hour, and I'm sure there's been some great chats there somewhere or other. And I just want to see where we are. I might just go into things here, live chat. Oh, okay. I can't see live chat, so I don't know why the live chat's not working, but that's just a YouTube thing. So look, what I suggest you do, if you are watching and you want to send me a message or whatever, or ask me a question, is just make a comment on the video, and I'll come back to these a little bit later. And I'll probably also sort of break up this live stream into a couple of videos during the week, and maybe answer some of your comments in those videos as well. So I'm sorry about the chat sort of situation. It looks to me like there are people viewing and all that sort of stuff, and it seems to be working on the YouTube, but the live chat just doesn't seem to be opening. So sorry about that. Working within my technical limitations. Maybe someone from YouTube can send me a message about what's going wrong. Okay, let me then talk about some of the reactions before we get into the actual detail of what Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov have said. So yeah, a lot of people are in shock, and a nice example here is Timothy Garton-Ash, a veteran journalist, really of the end of the Cold War, who's become a very strong advocate of the Atlanticist position, and he has a Substack. I think his Substack largely produces the material he writes for other newspapers. And in that he says history has gone into overdrive in the first weeks of Donald Trump's second term as he bulldozes principles, institutions and partnerships that US foreign policy and the transatlantic alliance have cultivated for more than 75 years. And he had all sorts of weird historical comparisons. Then we have one of my favourites, Timothy Snyder, who I worry about Timothy, but I won't go too much into that as well. But he says, at the Munich Security Conference, Americans asked the Ukrainian president to concede half of his country's mineral wealth forever in exchange for a pat on the head today. So Timothy finally has shed his illusions about American policy. It could well be that the United States intends to use the threat of Russian violence in order to seize Ukrainian wealth. A protection racket, in other words. And I think elsewhere, Timothy also talked about, well, maybe China could come and help redevelop Ukraine, given the Americans have made such a mess of it. So there has been a lot of reactions, and I talked about a lot of that before, didn't I? And it is very confusing, I think, and one of the reasons it's confusing is, our emotions get in play. Like I talked in my video on the Duran about the way in which the hope that Trump will be better than Biden has perhaps lured Alexander Mercouris and Alex Christoforou of the Duran to be a little bit rose-tinted glasses in their assessment of the Trump revolution. And I won't get into that too much today, but similarly there's fear, there's arrogance, there's condescension. Some of the commentaries from some of the American commentators about Europe is really treating them as, infantile and pathetic is, I think, really quite doesn't serve them well. And you can also see that in some of the reactions of some of the European commentators. Let me look at Bruno Macias, who former Portuguese minister and has written quite a few books on America, some of which have been on foreign relations, on Eurasia, and also on new patterns of what America's role in the world. And he has written that it's clear that the US can no longer be regarded as a reliable ally for the Europeans, but the Trump administration's political ambitions for Europe mean that for now America is also an adversary, threatening democracy in Europe and even European territory in the case of Greenland. And he really talks about Europe quickly developing what has long been talked about as sovereign autonomy in both defence and security issues, but there are some real challenges for Europe around that. But I think also there are some challenges beyond the emotional reactions people have about just the information layers. There's a lot of things we really don't know about and cannot know about how the diplomacy is going to work, what the intentions of some of the key actors are. There's a lot of very conflicting information about that. Although there is at least now something a little bit firmer emerging with this meeting with Lavrov and Rubio. And also what we're also seeing is there are different narratives being brought into play. The whole America's the new world, Europe's the old world. America is the world of freedom and independence and democracy. Europe is the old world that's forever, on the verge of descending into its petty squabbles. And that was a word I think Lawrence Wilkinson used about the European leaders. Its ancient hatreds, its tendency to be authoritarian. And so there's a whole lot of conflicting narratives. What is the story of this war? When did it begin? Who provoked it? Who's to blame? All that sort of thing. And those stories become really important in the war termination phase. Are we gonna, with this war, try to get beyond the sort of attributing war guilt only to a single party, or are we going to sort of try to work out, well, let's get beyond who caused this, let's kind of work out what our problems are going forward. And then finally, it tests people's mental models for explaining war and explaining peace. What does cause war? And, that matters because what solves war? And often people will say, at last we've got a realist analysis of what's going on. But the realist analysis is actually only a limited explanation for what causes war. And I did a video last year on Richard Overy's brilliant book that everyone really ought to read, The Causes of War. And I'll include a link in the video descriptions later, but you should check that out. But what causes world order? What causes or provides for collective security? So there are all different ideas floating around about that. Do we need a concert of Europe? Do we need a concert of Eurasia? Do we need people just to follow the United Nations Charter? Is this a war about money and resources? Is that the only way it's going to be sorted out? Is it Is it a war about Russia reasserting its empire, or the lack of democracy in Russia, or is it a war about American primacy in Europe and Eurasia? So all those sort of different kind of explanations feed into people's assessment of the situation. And I think as you're observing these events over the next little while, I think then bear that in mind, these conflicting emotions, the different narratives in place, and also the different explanations in place as well. And just have a bit of a think about what are some of the implied assumptions in people's commentaries and what they reveal. So let's now go to the very interesting information that's come forward just in the last day, well, in the last few hours, after the Secretary of State for the United States, Marco Rubio, and the Foreign Minister, I think that's his title, for the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, met in Riyadh, hosted by Saudi Arabia. And they have both provided sort of brief press conferences, and they have also both provided press statements. And let me bring up first the American press statement. This is just the key extract from it. It is quite short. The stuff above that is really just saying, these people met. And below it is thanks to Saudi Arabia for hosting the meeting. But in the press conference, Marco Rubio stated that there were 4 points agreed between the United States and Russia as to what's happening. The first of those was what Marco Rubio in his talk, it's expressed somewhat differently there, said is they want to re-establish functional diplomatic missions and functional normal professional diplomatic relations between Russia and the United States. Thank goodness, it's been a long time since that happened. But there are some also quite significant practical matters in there. They said addressing, and the way it's expressed in Marco Rubio's press statement is to establish a consultation mechanism to address irritants to our bilateral relationship with the objective of taking steps necessary to normalise the operation of our respective diplomatic missions. So no one's going to get to a peace unless there is actually diplomats resourced and able to do a peace. Now, that's a very vague statement there. Sergei Lavrov was a little bit clearer about what he meant by that, and I'll get to that in a second. But Marco Rubio certainly said that the American embassy in Moscow is operating under some level of, difficulties or constraints. Much of this actually goes back to events at the end of the Barack Obama presidency and the start of the Donald Trump presidency, where various actions were taken by the Americans against Russian diplomatic missions, and countermeasures were similarly taken. So this is actually unwinding a problem that goes back to 2016. If not earlier. Secondly, they said that they're appointing high-level teams to begin working on a path to ending the conflict in Ukraine as soon as possible in a way that is enduring, sustainable, and acceptable to all sides. So they are beginning a process for the conflict in Ukraine to begin. An excellent thing, an excellent initiative, but it again, note how cautiously it's expressed. They're appointing teams to begin working on a path to ending the conflict, but yet it's also the outcome, the standard by which that process will be measured, if you like, is it's enduring, it's sustainable, and it's acceptable to all sides. And that's a significant progress over ceasefires or temporary ceasefires or frozen conflicts and other such American non-diplomatic agreements. Then thirdly, they said lay the groundwork for future cooperation on matters of mutual geopolitical interest and historic economic and and investment opportunities which will emerge from a successful end to the conflict in Ukraine. In his spoken comments, Marco Rubio was a little bit more concise and basically said that they're looking for cooperation that could result from the end of the conflict in Ukraine. So if we go back to my comments, that this is not just about it's not just the war termination phase of the conflict in Ukraine, it's the very early stages, the opening of a gate to a war termination phase in the other long-standing conflict between the United States and Russia, and also the long-standing conflict, let's say, between the United States and the expectations of the rest of the world for a genuinely fair world order. The sort of end of the post-1945 world, and one doesn't know specifically what were the geopolitical conflicts and what were the interests, but I think this is more about saying we are going to, if you like, prove first that we can actually establish decent diplomatic relations, then prove that we can resolve this conflict or establish a process to resolve the conflict in Ukraine. And then after that, we will be keeping our eyes open for a potential broader level of cooperation and resolution of matters. So this is also starting a process that is going to go for years, folks. So don't expect this, despite all the other stuff, this will last. This will be resolved in a couple of weeks. And then finally, the fourth point was the parties to today's meetings pledge, interesting comment, they pledge to remain engaged to make sure the process moves forward in a timely and productive manner. That is, they're meaning effectively Sergei Lavrov and Marco Rubio is entirely appropriate. The foreign ministers of these two states are managing this process. It is not. It's not especially appointed envoys and all that sort of thing. So that's all very good stuff. Now, Sergei Lavrov has also, and before I leave that, I should just make just a couple of comments also on the manner of Marco Rubio's press conference. Marco Rubio was really quite sober and careful in his words. Michael Waltz was also there. Michael Waltz was rather less careful in his words, and his words were, Michael Waltz, the National Security Advisor, was much more, I guess his points were much more addressed to an American domestic political audience. There were a lot of pumping up of Trump and saying, only Donald Trump could have resolved this. And, this, I think, is being badged as the win, so to speak, for Donald Trump against his promise to have ended the conflict in Ukraine in a short period of time. And that's all very well. But I did notice a couple of things about Marco Rubio's comments, particularly he emphasised, he to some degree cleaned up after Michael Waltz, who I thought was a little bit heavy-handed, and in a way some of the tension between them was interesting. I noticed maybe speculative, perhaps, maybe a little bit of body language tension between Marco Rubio, who was just staring coldly in front of him when J.D. Vance met with Zelensky the other day. I think J.D. Vance might have been freelancing just a little bit the other day. And then he emphasised really three key things. One, that's Marco Rubio. Everyone has to be okay with this, and there was talk about everyone, not just United States and Russia, but Ukraine, EU, others. So there, I think much more so than perhaps people, if people focus on EU being cut out and everything like that, I think that needs to be interpreted against the very early first steps, the very first confidence building measures that have been in place here. The United States is kind of re-establishing itself as a credible diplomatic partner or a diplomatic interlocutor, to use a sort of old-fashioned term, someone you can actually genuinely talk to, and whose pledges to remain involved will be kept. And then also he mentioned that the main outcome, he summarised this meeting outcome as establishing a line of communication, the first step of a long process. And then thirdly, he also said his view of diplomacy, it's not words, it's not statements, it's based on actions. So again, I would interpret this as a positive sign, really, that perhaps America is also starting to really get the message that, grandstanding for the American domestic audience, like J.D. Vance did the other day, or or insisting that Europe pay 5% of its budget, and America wants to switch to China, but we're not doing anything about our bases or anything else about NATO command. That, like Peter Hegseth said the other day, maybe Marco Rubio, who has been a little bit more judicious and calm, has a more realistic sense of what the rest of the world expects of America, which is, well, you've got to rebuild confidence that America is agreement capable, that America will do what it says, and that America will respect the interests of other nations as well as its own. So I think they were all positive signs. I've been a little bit sceptical about Marco Rubio's multipolar remark, and it's still very early days, but I think his performance in recent days is over this first couple of early tests are much more impressive than Pete Hegseth, the debt collector from the Defence Department, or J.D. Vance, the hillbilly elegy, the writer of hillbilly elegies about European decline. So we shall see. We shall see. I still think a lot of the American elite comments are coming from a point of defeat, but I also think it's important, although Marco Rubio may be seen as the kind of neoconservative, the irredeemable neoconservative, and some of his attitudes towards China and whatnot are seriously concerning, I would say. I do think perhaps Rubio is probably the key person who can maybe start to, at least in relationship to Russia, start to rebuild America's credibility with the world. But we will see. It's a long way, and we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. Now, Sergei Lavrov also commented, and he broadly had similar comments, and I will just comment on them briefly. But there were a couple of key points he really emphasised. First, he said he had a genuine sense that Russia's concerns had been heard, not just listened to, but heard. He said there was a sense that the United States was beginning to understand Russia's position. But he also emphasised that this meeting was a first step towards mutual understanding. It was not in any way bringing positions closer. So again, it's about confidence building. I think we need to interpret this step as a test for America, a test for Russia, to rebuild confidence that there can be dialogue and genuine diplomacy between Russia and America, to actually institutionally re-establish that diplomacy. And but the process is quite a long way to go. So we're not quite at peace in our time yet. He also said there was a mutual desire to find specific solutions. Again, I think we're in let's solve specific manageable problems before we get further ahead, even though we know there's a long journey ahead of us to actually perhaps walk together towards a different sort of pattern of international relations that hasn't really happened yet in the post-1945 world. And he said there were open, definite disagreements, but a emerging sense that those discrepancies had to be regulated in a way that avoided conflict. And again, I think that's a good sign. Then in terms of the specific agreements, there's also a press release from the Russian Federation there saying the participants discussed a broad range of issues, including prospects for normalising bilateral relations, rather clearer language than what was in the US press conference. The sides agreed to appoint respective ambassadors as soon as possible and to start consultations at the level of deputy foreign ministers to remove restrictions on the diplomatic missions of the two countries. The sides agreed to establish a dialogue to identify ways to resume cooperation in the economy, including energy, outer space exploration, and other areas of mutual interest. The comments about the Russian ambassador to the United States, that has been decided by the Russian government and is awaiting US government approval. It's been there for several months. Maybe it was held up by Biden. It hasn't been acted on by Trump. Too busy signing executive orders, maybe. And obviously, if you can't even appoint an ambassador to a country, coming to a agreement over a conflict of a war in which you are a party, to, as the United States is a party to the war, is going to be a little bit complicated. So that's what they said there. Much more clear and specific about the diplomatic processes. The sides exchanged views on the situation surrounding Ukraine and reiterated their mutual commitment to settle the conflict. The Russian side emphasised the importance of eliminating the root causes of the conflict, creating proper conditions for achieving a lasting and enduring peace, and ensuring security and legitimate interests of all countries in the region. What the region is not yet specified. An agreement was reached to continue joint work in this area through special envoys to be appointed in the near future. So that's the team to work out the process. And then thirdly, the sides agreed to resume communication channels to discuss other international issues, being mindful of Russia and the United States' special responsibilities in matters of peace and security, as nuclear powers and permanent members of the UN Security Council, the interest in continuing joint work to prepare the meeting between Russian and American presidents was confirmed. Again, the summit might attract a lot of interest. People might think it's all going to happen real soon, etc. Sergei Lavrov's comments around the summit also indicated to me it might be some time off, that there's still a lot of work to be done to work out agenda, process, date, all these kind of things, agreed processes, and it will be to some degree dependent upon the confidence building measures emerging out of these sort of issues. And what I can also say, having watched Sergei Lavrov's press conference, understanding a little bit of the Russian, but also relying on the Google Translate in the captions, which you can do too, and I put links to both the the Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov press conferences on the Riyadh meeting in the video description or the live stream description. He did emphasise a couple of other things that I thought were very, very interesting. Now, first of those was that was about that appointment of the special envoys. Now, Keith Kellogg has been named as the special envoy for Trump's special envoy of the US peace. He's made all sorts of pretty off-the-wall remarks, or perhaps just pretty unfocused remarks, or pretty doctrinaire remarks. And I noted that that Sergei Lavrov said, we are waiting to hear who the US representative is, their name and their position. So I would say that they're actually looking for someone a bit more substantial who the Russians can have confidence in, who is not Keith Kellogg. And they said once that person has been named, and interesting, they also should say what their position is. So they also want someone who I think they're probably looking for someone with more substantial authority and a real function in government, rather than an octogenarian retired general who has no responsibility for anything to be the US representative. It occurs to me saying this, I wonder even whether someone like Tulsi Gabbard might play that role. And he said once the US names their person, the Russians will name their representative. So the choice of the special envoy is the first test for the United States. It will be interesting to see how they respond. Let's hope they don't fall at that first hurdle. But I read those comments to say that I suspect the Russians have also told the Americans, for this to work, you need someone substantial, you need someone they can trust, and you need someone with a real position. And I'm not 100% convinced that the businessman, Whitloff, I think his name is, would be that person. I think they're actually looking for a genuine representative of the US government. But that is me reading between the lines. I might be wrong there. It may well be the Whitloff chap, although I suspect he's more playing a role with the business interests rather than with the real hard, difficult issues of government and diplomacy. And then this was reinforced to me by a question that was asked by Sergei Lavrov about a reference to a 3-point plan, which I'm not really aware of, that has been floating around somewhere, maybe in one of the American press, about a 3-point plan. And he said, we don't know anything about it. And what's more, he said he asked Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz about it. He said that he had seen a press report about a meeting between the Polish foreign minister and Applebaum's husband Sikorski, and Keith Kellogg on the margins of the Munich security dialogue, where apparently it was Keith Kellogg, the alleged special envoy, who said there was a 3-point plan and they were thinking about it. And Sergei Lavrov reported that he asked in the meeting in Riyadh Marco Rubio and Michael Waltz directly about this. What is this? And he said that they said it was fake. So I would say that's a bit of a message, I would say, about both to the United States about not not giving Sikorski too much of a role in things, and maybe also not giving Kellogg a role in things. And also quite interesting that Marco Rubio should say that. Okay, so that's the situation with the conflict. I'm really disappointed, folks, that I can't see your comments, but I guess I hope you can all sort of leave me some comments in the chat. In like the normal comments in YouTube, I've been going yesterday afternoon. I spent some time going through the many comments on my Duran video, so thank you everyone for making those. So I do try to respond to comments as much as I can, depending on workload and all that sort of thing. So it's actually a really interesting process for me to hear the sort of viewpoints from all around the world about how this sort of thing is developing. And no doubt many of you who are watching today have insights into what might be going on, or theories about what's going on, or questions you might want to ask me about it all. And I think it would be really great if you just sort of leave me some of those questions in the comments. Okay, so let me transition to the next little part of the show. I was going to talk a little bit about the sort of responses in the EU and in Europe, but also about some of the narrative frameworks and some of the issues involved in the explanatory frameworks. And I guess I've been a little bit reluctant to comment on the whole Russia-Ukraine war situation over the last year or two on the channel, really since I guess I sort of was commenting really until mid 2020, maybe early 2023. And I feel it was, the domestic situation, around political situation around the Russia-Ukraine war has been a little bit difficult. And I didn't want to get myself into trouble, didn't want to get myself on certain lists maintained by certain people in Ukraine. But I feel now it's perhaps a good time to start to comment. Of course, it's almost the 3rd anniversary of the war, and over all that time I have been trying to sort of think through the analysis of this very, very major event that's going on in our world and what it all means about the rebalancing of power in the world, the rebalancing of cultural perspectives in the world, the geopolitics of it all, but also the what we learn about history from it, what we learn about how good and bad history can lead to good or bad political decisions, good or bad responses from the public. I was genuinely shocked in some ways about the way in which people, the broad public as well as the media, etc., responded to the outbreak of the war, in the latest phase of the war in Ukraine. And it has been a really interesting thing about the way in which people bring big assumptions about narratives about world history, the post-1945 world, the Atlantic Alliance, freedom and democracy versus autocracy, all these kind of big narrative ideas to their sort of reaction to events, both emotional reaction as well as conceptual reaction, political reactions, but also the way in which it's played out socially for people. I think that's been one of the horrible things about some of the the way in which people have been mistreated because of their beliefs about a war that no one really wanted to happen. Well, no one. Many of the people who were involved didn't really want to happen, and that is, as all wars do, involves enormous amounts of tragedy. But there has been a bit of a freak out in the EU and a range of different responses. I've noticed Michael McFaul was over at the Munich Security Conference, and he described J.D. Vance's comments and the potential backing out of the US from the Ukraine war as the biggest crisis of transatlantic relations in his lifetime. I've referred to Anne Applebaum, who appears to have judiciously taken out Polish citizenship just in time to be the US foreign policy minister in exile in Warsaw. And there was also a very interesting comment from the Jean-Philippe Tanguy, who is the French Rassemblement National, not Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marie Le Pen's political party in France, commenting that although he had some sympathies with some of the particular positions that J.D. Vance was talking about, he abhorred J.D. Vance's intervention with his speech because it was, clumsy, hillbilly, harangue, inept intervention in the domestic affairs of Europe. But there's also been a really interesting article by Patrick Armstrong saying Europe gets an anatomy lesson, which is sort of saying, well, there has been this long-standing conflict between EU and the United States. And, famously, well, he begins the article by quoting Victoria Newland's famous comment from the leaked phone call about the Ukraine Maidan coup in 2014 about, an anatomy lesson for the European Union. I'm sure viewers may well know what I'm referring to, but do check those comments out if you get a chance. I think I might do another video in the next week or two about the sort of narrative of the Ukraine war, but I have discussed that reasonably well. I think it's really important in this context, and I think Jacques Bode has just done a brilliant discussion with Nima over at Dialogue Works, where he points out that Ukraine was an aggressor in this war. Began in 2014, and also in 2021, the Ukraine government declared it wanted to take back Crimea and began to assemble forces to attack the Donbass. And I think the other thing to bear in mind in terms of the narrative is the US party is a war. There was a fascinating exchange with Keith Kellogg and a journalist. I'm not sure who it was. I assume it was a journalist, some sort of panel host at the Munich Security Conference, where Kellogg was fumbling around talking about diplomacy. And why would the EU or Ukraine be involved? And the journalist basically asked, so who is the perpetrator and who is the intermediary? The US is not just an intermediary in this event. It is a party to the war, and as Emmanuel Dodd has been saying, it is a party that has endured a strategic defeat. And this is really critical to things. But I think I might get more into the whole narrative about the war a little bit later. But I just want to re-emphasize my point earlier on that this is about more than just the termination of the Ukraine conflict. This is the very tentative, very fragile beginning of not even the termination phase, but the opening of the vista of a termination phase, of the end to the very long-standing, war, if you like, conflict, if you like, strategic competition, if you like, between the United States or the Anglo-Americans and Russia, and before that the Soviet Union, and before that Russia, and also it is part of the remaking of the world order. It's part of the breakdown of the post-1945 world, and the sort of response of the world to the breakdown of US primacy. Of course, over at my Substack, let me just give everyone a thing there, jeffrich.substack.com, where you can learn from history and live in tune with a changing world. I do a weekly history book recommendation. I'm going through the United States at the moment, and we'll be looking at 4 other major powers around the world: China, India, Europe, and Russia, over 2025. And I also do deep dives every Wednesday. And what's more, if you become a paid subscriber, that's where you get the deep dives, all the deep dives, as well as the preview. And you can also get access to my 30-page guide to the post-1945 world, based on the brilliant work by John Darwin, Rise and Fall of Global Empires, whose history I've been using as the basis for my series of videos on the rise and fall of global empires. And I think this is the key thing that we're sort of seeing. We're seeing the breakdown of the post-1945 world, and the re-establishment of diplomatic, economic, security, cultural institutions and processes to sort of bind together in a reasonable web of exchange and contact the new powers and the new cultures of the newly constituted world, the post-2024 world, or perhaps the post-2025 world. 80 years after the kind of not fully resolved World War II, never really a proper peace agreement in Europe, never truly a proper peace agreement in East Asia and the West Pacific. We're seeing the all the parties involved asserting the need for a better arrangement. Now, this is often expressed in the terms of a collective security agreement, the need for a collective security agreement in Europe. That was one of the key proposals that Russia made in 2021. It proposed the broad heads of a security agreement between a post-Cold War, post-1945 security agreement in Europe that would ensure peace and development in the European peninsula of Eurasia. And I think this is one of the key outcomes that we're working to. It's one of the key things a lot of people have pointed to, but I think what a lot of people are also missing is that when we're talking about the breakdown of the post-1945 world order, the post-1945 American-led world order, the breakdown of NATO, we're also talking about not just the security arrangements in Europe, we're talking about the collective security arrangements across the entirety of Eurasia. And one of the key things I kind of focus on in that post-1945 World History Guide, and which is critical to the assessment by John Darwin in his history, is he talks about the partition of Eurasia. At the end of World War II, relatively rapidly, within 5 years, absolutely unique historical situation emerges, which is that an unprecedented historical situation emerges, which is that an external power, the United States, entrenches itself militarily, politically, socially. It literally occupies Japan. It literally occupies Germany, and imposes constitutions upon them, and establishes military bases. But it establishes itself at both ends of Eurasia, in Europe and in East Asia and the West Pacific. And these, as well, I guess you could also add in West Asia, the whole Israel-Palestine issue, the management of Iran and Iraq and the Gulf states, etc. And also, as the British Empire disintegrates and the Suez Canal crisis and all these sorts of things, as well as, I guess, the partition that was established in South Asia, tragically so, as the British Empire withdrew from India in 1947. And, these issues remain with us today. Taiwan, Korea, India and Pakistan, the Middle East, the conflict between Israel and Palestine and all the associated conflicts, and of course the lingering problem of the border of security in Europe. It's moved from Berlin progressively eastward to end up now, like, potentially, if America and Europe had its way, at Kursk province of Russia, at near Rostov-on-Don, rather than Kiev or Lviv or somewhere more sensible, right on the doorstep of Russia. So I think when we talk about collective security, I think this is something people need to bear in mind, that it's not just Europe, it's actually Eurasia. and the historically unprecedented situation of America establishing itself on both ends of Eurasia, seeming to have, be almost about to achieve, Mackinder's dream of controlling the world island, and hence controlling the world, if only those damn Soviets weren't in the way, then, or China, or America hadn't lost China. This is an utterly unprecedented historical situation. And when Americans talk about the US-led based world order, I think it's really important to remember that there is a hard physical, a brutal fact, as John Mearsheimer says. He doesn't often actually refer to this brutal fact, but the American-led world order, post-1945 world order, relies upon this utterly unprecedented and also utterly unsustainable situation where the United States has military bases, has 100 times more military bases than any other country in the world, and they're all over the world, and that they have effectively extraterritorial rights over European nations, Japan, Taiwan, all that sort of thing. So that they have this partition of Eurasia entrenched. So that by opening up the question of collective security in Europe, you are also opening up the question of the collective security of Eurasia as a whole. And this was formally recognised, I think, by President Xi and Putin after their meeting last year in Beijing, where there was an acknowledgement or statement, I think, that they wanted to begin a process of establishing collective security in Eurasia without external parties. That historically unprecedented situation that was established by military force, including the use of weapons of mass destruction in Japan, of having an external power dominating, providing a security umbrella to the entirety of Eurasia, is utterly unsustainable and also just no longer necessary in a world of more evenly distributed power, a world in which resources, wealth, power, cultural dynamism is coming as much from China, India, Russia, Iran, West Asian countries, the whole world. It's not all driven by the West. And I think that is the really big, long-term, slow historical process that this meeting in Riyadh is a very, very first step towards, and that is likely to, probably take maybe, 10, 20, maybe 50 years. You could even compare, I think, the slow, let's say the slow withdrawal of the United States from Eurasia as equivalent, I guess, almost to the process of decolonisation that happened after 1945. That took, it was still going in the mid-1970s. In some ways, it is still going. I mean, it was only last year that France was really kicked out of some of its major possessions or crypto colonies in Africa. It still has a colony in New Caledonia, and Britain still has all sorts of weird possessions all over the world, as indeed does the United States. So the process of decolonisation was long, difficult, slow, and had many twists and turns. I think we are, given the unsustainability of the partition of Eurasia in a way at the start of a similar process. When people talk about Donald Trump retrenching the American empire and focusing on the American homeland, and isn't it a good thing that, he's sort of, buying off Greenland and, seizing Canada and the Panama Canal. These are the sort of erratic, fitful reactions at a very early stage, I think, to the American leadership group, leadership class, very divided leadership class, coming to terms with the big historical process that is underway, which is ultimately this partition of Eurasia is unsustainable, has to end. America has to let go and become a country like every other country that sort of acts sort of within its borders, can still be a kind of a world state, exercise significant influence, but not do it on the basis of extraterritorial rights and military bases all around the world. Not do it on the basis of hillbilly harangues by J.D. Vance against a country or a set of countries that deserve a hell of a lot more respect than they were provided in the Munich security dialogue. I guess one's only consolation is, J.D. Vance's capabilities were somewhat exposed in that speech. So they're the main things I really probably wanted to talk about today. I've been talking pretty much non-stop for an hour and a half. I think I might bring it near an end there. Again, my apologies for not being able to do the sort of live stream, the comment process. I hope everything worked out well otherwise with the video. I'm going to break this video up a little bit, maybe into shorter bits, and maybe add into that some of the extra comments I had about explanatory frameworks. But I hope, the key message I would add is there are some hopeful signs, but don't get overexcited, don't overrate them. I think we are at the early steps of confidence building measures in diplomacy between of what could be quite a long process of terminating the Ukraine conflict, but also terminating those at least two other conflicts around American primacy or Eurasian partition and the long-standing Russia or Anglo-American conflict with Russia. It's a very positive thing that is the case, but there are a lot of difficult issues to be resolved yet, and I don't have an awful lot of faith in Donald Trump's capabilities. A little bit more positive about Marco Rubio's capabilities after the last couple of days, but still there's a lot of confidence building I feel the United States needs to do from my perspective. And whatever you think about it, let me know in the comments. I'd love to respond. And also do join me at jeffrich.substack.com. Pick up as a paid subscriber my post-1945 World Guide, and follow my world history tour of world powers this year, where I'm looking at Russia, China, India, the United States, current focus, and the European Union. And we'll talk more about all these issues in a live stream in 2 weeks' time. Thanks for watching.